How's it going?
Good, good, good.
Yeah. Are you busy these days?
Yeah, extremely busy these days. It's March at the university, which is like crunch time extraordinaire. I've got all kinds of presentations for conferences, experiments running, and then I'm doing the video series and just a ton of interview and podcasts. So, yeah, it's crazy busy right now. Very, very busy.
Is this like a new thing for you, this increased exposure and interest in your work? Because I've been watching your lecture series on YouTube, and I've seen those numbers go up and up.
Yeah.
And is that something new for you, or is that something you've done in the past?
I had put courses on YouTube before, and they got sort of, interest in the thousands kind of thing. Largely students and, sort of the CogSci community. But a lot of my students came to me and said, you should do much better quality, much more comprehensive argument and put it in a format that's going to be accessible to a larger lay audience. And so I put the video series together, and that just started 10 weeks ago. And since then, there's just been an explosion of interest.
Yeah. One of the things I was wondering, I find it just it seems very generous to me. I'm someone that never went to university. So to have access to that kind of learning experience is amazing. And I was wondering, like, if you got any blowback from the university or even the students who have paid a lot of money for that education.
No. I think it's fair to say that what the students are getting in the class is taking place at a deeper level. For example, the episodes are 1 hour, whereas when I'm lecturing, it's 3 hours, right? And there's direct presentation, direct dialogue, that they can ask and have questions answered. They can debate me directly. They get to write essays and get critical feedback. They get to come to office hours. So I don't think they feel underprivileged in that way. I think instead, I would, like I said, they have come to me, and many of them, both, just in after class, and then a group of them specifically said, look, I want to donate my time. I'm going to put together a video team for videotaping and editing you. I'm going to help you manage your Twitter. I'm going to help you manage, this is all students who have come and said, look, we really believe in what you're doing and your arguments and your ideas. We want more people to see them. And so I take that as evidence that they are feeling, rather than being slighted in some way, that they're getting to contribute and participate in the generation of something that they find valuable.
Yeah, great. So the current lecture series that you're putting out online is concerning what you describe as a crisis of meaning.
Yes, yes.
And watching it got me thinking about this idea of meaning and experiences that we find meaningful and having a meaningful life. And I don't think it's something that I've ever looked into for myself before. What is it that makes a particular experience meaningful?
Yeah.
What is it that makes life meaningful? And to really look at what are the components of an experience that feels meaningful to us. And I thought that'd be a great place to start, is just try to get a sense of what is meaning and what makes something meaningful.
Well, that in one sense, that's what the 50 hours of the series are all trying to answer. So I hope your listeners will take it be charitable in my answer, that I'm trying to take a very long and complicated argument and put it in a respectful fashion to address your question. And just one thing about that, I think and what the series makes clear is there's two aspects to this question. There's a historical, cultural aspect, right? There's our culture has a history that has given us a grammar, ways of thinking about what makes something meaningful, and that has to be taken into account in the answer. And then there is the scientific investigation, which investigates the more universal processes, sort of the structural, functional organization of cognitive and conscious processes and how those contribute to meaning. And they are inextricably intertwined. So I'm going to answer, I can't really answer the cultural historical one. I would point like I said, your listeners to the 10 episodes that have unfolded so far and are unfolding. I think it has a lot to do with things that happened in the Axial Revolution and whatnot. So I'll just focus in on the scientific side right now. And so there's growing research, and I'm doing some really important work with a group of students. We're going to be presenting a paper together at APA, and then we're going to be writing up, just canvassing all of the current psychological theories on meaning, what makes life meaningful. There's also important philosophical arguments by people like Susan Wolf and others, and then there's my own work. And so I'm trying to draw all of that together, but. I would argue that the core of what we're talking about when we're making a process meaningful is how we're ultimately doing three things in an integrated fashion. How we're making pieces of information relevant to us by making pieces of information relevant to each other. And then once we can do that, we can make what we're doing relevant to the world and relevant to other people. So this idea of making things relevant, I think, is the key thing. And why that's so important, and I have published arguments and presentations on this, is this ability to zero in on relevant information and find it salient and obvious so that the world becomes a coherent arena for your action, and you model yourself as a coherent agent for acting in the arena, and they're appropriate and they fit and they belong together. I think that's the core thing. Now, when that gets taken up into sort of the structuring of people's lives, right? The narrative structuring, the interactional structuring. It sort of plays out in three important ways. It plays out, and there's increasing experimental evidence for this, that when people have a sense of coherence, when there's sort of a structured intelligibility, like I just laid out, of the world and of themselves, if you just induce that in people experimentally, just by showing them meaningful scenes, they will start to rate their lives as more meaningful, just because you're introducing more coherence into their processing, because they're getting that sense of connectedness to the world, right? Mm-hmm. People also, it also plays out, right, in the idea that we care for others. And this is, I think, part of Susan Wolf's idea that to find our lives meaningful is to believe that we're connected to something that has a value independent of our valuing it. It's not, there's some things I value just because I like them. Right? But there's some things I try to say, and of course this has philosophical difficulties associated with it, but I say, I like it because it's a good thing. I care about it, right? I would want that thing to survive and go on even if I weren't here, like my children, for example, my partner, my friends, right? And also aspects of the world, works of art, aspects of the natural environment. Like I don't want anybody destroying the Grand Canyon ever, right? Things like that. And so, we need to care about things that have a value independent. And we also need to know that people care for us as persons, not just as, useful cogs in a machine or having a use value. There's that. And all of that has to fit together so that there's a kind of a narrative coherence, right? So that we have and the way the agent and the arena fit together, like I said, is, and there's clear evidence that this applies. It's not sort of natural to us, right? That we are a story and the world is a story, and those two stories fit together very well. And when we have all of those, if we have that sort of narrative order of a story within story, it gives us a sense of purpose. If we have that sort of caring about things that have a value beyond us so that we can transcend ourselves, that's kind of a normative order, right? And then when everything fits together coherently, intelligibly, that's a nomological order. And Chris Mastropietro and Philip Misovic and I talked about those three orders in the zombie book, and that how the zombies are a mythology about how all those orders are collapsing for historical reasons. And we're only now starting to get the scientific answer that may allow us to restore them from a scientific point of view. Now, of course, there's important experiences that really enhance that connectedness that I'm talking about. That the flow experience really intensifies that agent arena connectedness, that salience of things, and that deep enmeshment, right? And so, of course, if people have more flow experiences, they rate their lives better. Right. And also, I'm now currently arguing, not just me. There's evidence from the Griffiths lab and other that if you have more mystical experiences, you rate your life as more meaningful. We've just done a huge MTurk experiment in which if you've had mystical experiences, that is predictively correlated with how meaningful you find your life. And I'm trying to understand what's the cognitive machinery going on in these mystical and awakening experiences that makes people rate their lives as more meaningful because they've had them. And we know that there's real changes. Yaden has all this research showing that people's lives do sort of get better along many measures that they care about after these experiences. And we do know, again, from the Griffiths lab, that after having said mystical experiences, people actually have a fundamental change in their personality structure. The personality trait of openness, and though these traits are supposed to be stable, right? The personality trait of openness actually goes up after these experiments, and after longitudinal investigation, it still remains at an increased level. So there's real changes happening in people at the level of their personality and in their life that seem to support their claims that their lives are getting better and they are fundamentally changed and connected to the world in a different way. Sorry, that was supposed to be short. Sorry.
That's good. I know from your lecture series that once you get going, it's like a train going full steam. But what you're saying, like, when I was thinking about, what makes something meaningful in my life, I was thinking of these qualities that I associate with those meaningful experiences. And the ones I came up with were presence, a sense of openness, and curiosity. And then when I have those qualities, no matter what I'm engaging in, I do feel that interconnectedness. So when I'm holding those qualities with another person, I feel it's been a meaningful interaction. And there is that element of authentic connection, whether that's in nature or in a conversation, or even when I'm doing my yoga practice. I was trying to think, like, why does my yoga practice feel so meaningful to me? Even if I'm not bringing in, a bunch of ideas, and
no, you don't need the ideas,
and chanting to a deity or anything, but just the act of connecting with my breath and body just feels inherently meaningful without me being able to pinpoint exactly what it is about that experience. But the only thing I could come up with was just feeling connected and present and curious.
So the connectedness is definitely what I'm talking to you about, right? That deep connectedness, that I call it religio. I mean, it's a potential etymological root for religion. It means binding, connected. And it's what the relevance realization is doing, right? It's not cold calculation. It's how you're choosing what to pay attention to. And you talk about presence. It's what's standing out for you as salient. What is generating affordances for you. So this is presenting itself to me as a glass, and I am fitting myself to it. There's an affordance of graspability. So it is present to me in an important way. Dan Chiappy and I are actually going through a lot of the work on this. I just read a wonderful article I'm sorry, I can't remember the author's name, and she deserves to be remembered, right? But it's called Seeing Like a Rover, and it's talking about the scientists who are managing the rover on Mars. And what's really interesting is that, like, they don't just talk about it or think about it. They try to embody, they try and enact. Right. So they'll do things like they'll put their hands up like this is where the cameras are, and they'll move around and they say, we, not the rover, we will hit like a stone here. And there's these processes, right? And you can see how those are taken up in things like the flow experience, because in flow, people feel this tremendous at-one-ment, and they feel the world as vividly present. It's super salient. It's standing out to them. I think, and this will pick up on the curiosity and openness that you're pointing to, I've argued, and so has, I believe, I think there's a similar argument in Newberg. I think that's what's going on in flow, and I published on this with Leo Ferraro and Ariane Hara-Bennett last year in the Oxford Handbook of Spontaneous Thought. we think flow is a chain of insights. Like when you have an insight, like you've been trying to solve a problem and you realize you've misframed the problem, aha, and you get that opening up and you get that flash, that moment of supersalience. That's where we put a light bulb over people's head. And you get this opening and this aha, and there's a sense of curiosity and exploration, right? And if you chain a bunch of those together, you get the flow experience. And I think you're getting into something like the flow experience. Why that's relevant to what I'm talking about is what you're doing in insight is you're recognizing. I'm playing on the word recognizing. You're recognizing what you find relevant and salient, and you're finding that that really good fittedness and connectedness to the problem. And so that's the curiosity and the openness. And I think when you chain a bunch of those together, you get flow. And then I think when you flow for sort of those broad scale properties of coherence, and connectedness to the world at large, you can get the mystical experiences. So I agree with you. I think that's why, presence and openness and curiosity are phenomenological markers of when we feel these experiences as meaningful. I think there's one other element for you. I think you feel that the what you're engaged in or the practice you're engaged in is valuable, like it'd be valuable to other people, and it has a value independent, just that it's not just an idiosyncratic preference on your part. You're connecting to a larger tradition, a larger framework that, right, has an independent value to it.
That's a really good point, because, it's like what brought me to the yoga practice in the first place was finding something that allowed me to take care of my mental and physical health, which helped me be a better, more present, open, loving husband to my wife and family and friends. So yeah, it does have that larger purpose, which is something that Viktor Frankl points to. He talks about a meaningful life being a life where you're engaged in a purpose and responsibility for something greater than yourself.
Yeah, and Susan Wolf, in her excellent book, Meaning in Life and Why It Matters, argues, she has two main arguments. She has one argument that needs to be, I think, paid more attention to. She's got very good arguments that you can't reduce a meaningful life to a moral life, right? So that, or an aesthetically sort of pleasing life. It's an independent value. You could lead a very moral life, and it could be significantly less meaningful than another person. Now, she's not saying that you could have a fantastically meaningful life and be a moral monster. What she's saying is leading a moral life is not sufficient to having a meaningful life. There's more to it. And then what she argues, that more to itness, is exactly what you're talking about, that we feel connected to something. She puts it this way, that we have a subjective attraction, a powerful subjective attraction to something that is objectively attractive. And so it's you're really drawn to something that affords you to transcend yourself and to connect to something, to other people, to other contexts, to other aspects of reality, right, that are independently valuable.
Yeah, this is reminding me of how you start the whole lecture series. It's like kind of starting at the beginning of humanity and the first practices that we engaged in to find meaning, which is in shamanism.
Yes,
like the pre-religious practices of humanity. And can you speak a little bit about that and why you do focus on shamanism and like what it is? What are the common elements in shamanism that are meaning making?
Yeah, and I mean, I couldn't get into everything that I wanted to, which so many people, not all researchers, of course, think that that there's a fundamental change in the Upper Paleolithic transition. Now, some people have presented it, I think, incorrectly with this sort of idea of a Big Bang, that there's nothing before around 60,000 to 40,000 BC, and then all of a sudden there's all of this. There's clear precursors in Africa, but what you see in the Upper Paleolithic transition, you see a massive increase in the sophistication of technology that's being used, many different tools, projectile weapons. There's some evidence now that the Neanderthals might have been able to throw their spears, but they're nothing compared to the very thin bone-tipped spears and the spear throwers and eventually the bow and arrows that human beings are developing. So you got all these projectile weapons, you have calendars, you have innate jewelry, complex jewelry being made. Again, there might be some Neanderthals that are doing something very crudely similar. And you also have music, clear evidence for music, overwhelming evidence for representational art, pictures of animals, carvings. And so you got this massive explosion, and it doesn't seem to be biologically driven. I mean, this is a little bit contentious because, of course, soft tissue doesn't store in the fossil record, but we don't have any evidence for any sort of change in the brain size or organization. And so many people, myself included, think that we're not talking about a hardware change, we're talking about a software change. We're talking about the way the brain was being utilized and made use of, rather than a biological change. And I think this is supported by the really fantastic work of Michael Anderson in his ideas of cognitive exaptation and circuit reuse, that the brain evolves often by taking circuits that have evolved for one purpose and then exapting them and using them for another. Just to give your viewers a quick understanding of what exaptation is, my tongue originally evolved for tasting poison and moving food around in my mouth. And it just happens for evolutionary reasons to be in my air tract. So what that means is I can exapt that for speech, right? Because I have this highly sensitive, very flexible muscle that can interrupt airflow. So evolution doesn't have to create a speaking machine out of scratch. It can exapt this machine for that originally evolved for other purposes. And your brain is constantly doing that circuit reuse and exaptation, both across species and within individuals. And so I think it's highly likely that what we're seeing is sort of an exaptive software change. And so other people, Matt Rossano, David Lewis Williams, Winkleman, many people are arguing they think that what it is a set of psychotechnologies that involved creating altered states of consciousness. And for reasons that if your viewers want to see, I argue for in the 10th video, the one that's out right now, there's the connections between altering your state of consciousness and facilitating insight, facilitating what you find relevant or salient, opening up cognitive flexibility, and especially probably engendering something like the flow state, because current shamanic practice clearly induces people into the flow state by chanting, other disruptive strategies, right? Mindful strategies. And you see in shamanic practice, you see the integration of two things that we've sort of separated, but they can come together. These are mindfulness practices like meditation and contemplation. And these are, ritual practices that work let me put it another way, sort of more like hypnotic practices that work through powers of suggestion. And in ritual, you can actually see them coming together. Like, for example, when you're teaching meditation, you're teaching people mindfulness, but you speak to them in a pattern. Norman Farr pointed this out. That's very much like hypnotic induction. Mm-hmm. And when I'm doing Tai Chi, I'm obviously practicing mindfulness, but I'm doing a highly ritualized, repetitive, inductive practice. And so shamanism brings, sort of hypnosis and meditative stuff together. Leo and I published an article on a book on hypnosis and mindfulness in 2016. And so shamanism and shamanistic ritual is altering consciousness, altering what you find relevant or salient. It is inducing the flow state. It's bringing together these two, nascent psychotechnologies, and all of these things really increase, your capacities for insight, your capacities for picking up on other animals, other people's mental states, for inducing placebo effect in other human beings. And that should be really, people treat the placebo effect as something to be thrown away and ignored. If I can reliably induce the placebo effect in you, that's 40% of all current pharmacological medicine, right? And so if that's pretty good healthcare, right, in the upper Paleolithic period, if I can do that. So if you've got a shaman that can do all this transformation, right? Then, they're going to help you solve your social problems. They're going to help you find your animals. They're going to lead to insightful social and technological innovations. They're going to help heal you when you're sick. I mean, this is just huge, which is why shamanism tends to be, at least Michael Winkelmann, Matt Rossano, and others argue, it's a universal. And what seems to happen, right, around this time, all this artistic stuff seems to indicate the presence of much more metaphorical thought. And metaphorical thought is a clear instance, I think, of an increased capacity for insight. Because when I'm making a metaphor, I'm trying to get you to alter or restructure how you see things so that you have an insight into them you didn't have before. And I think that's, so I think, what you see in shamanism is a systematic set of psychotechnologies for altering states of consciousness and cognition that were enormously adaptive and therefore got written into our fundamental grammar of, how we make meaning as human beings. So we would now think, I mean, Nietzsche famously said, a life without music would be a mistake. We would think of a life bereft of, all these things invented in the upper Paleolithic transition, like art and music and, these really intricate athletic projectile, forms of interaction with, like, if I took that out of your life, you'd think your life was pretty meaningless in important ways.
Yeah, that's a good point. When you're talking about shamanism, one of the elements that I'm thinking of is the experience of the shamanic journey, the visionary journey, which is very much, to me, my experience of it is like a waking dream state where
very much like lucid dreaming.
Like where aspects of my subconscious are being presented to me as images, and I'm able to interact with them, which is much like a lucid dream. And then in decoding those images and symbols, finding the insight, getting those aha moments. But it's, what is it about the metaphor that helps us find the meaning when we're looking at a problem directly? We're maybe not able to see that, but having that presented to us as an image or a symbol allows us to see it in a different way and make those connections.
I think it's both that. I mean, I think it's important to pay attention to both your cognitive state and your state of consciousness, right? So typically what's blinding us in insight problems, so there's a man, he lives in a city in the United States and he marries 300 women in a year and he divorces none of them and none of them have died, and yet he breaks no law. How does he do it? He's a clergyman. He marries women. Right? He marries women. Now, you certainly know that that's a legitimate use of the word marry, right? To make two people into spouses. But that is not the obvious one that comes up first. You see, in sort of a normal state of consciousness, your default mode of cognition, you go to what is obvious and see, what I'm trying as a cognitive scientist to explain is, why do you find things obvious? Why do you find them salient? You start from there, and we all start from there as people. But as a scientist, I want to explain, how does your brain make that for you? And more pertinent to your point is, how does your brain determine when that's wrong, right? And so you're locked on, marry means to become a spouse. Oh, how can that be? How can that be? But if I alter your state of consciousness, and if I get you to alter what you're paying attention to, right? And those are often very closely connected, by giving you a different kind of framing, putting you, for example, into a narrative interactive framing rather than a straight problem-solving framing. So if I shift your framing and alter your state of consciousness, I can alter what you're finding obvious and salient, and then that can reveal what you need to see. You can, right, marry also means to make people into spouses rather than becoming a spouse. And so that's why you've got to do this right. You have to test and work out the psychotechnologies that will change cognition and consciousness. But what if they do that? That's how I can drive the insight.
Yeah, that's great. I never thought of riddles as a psychotechnology to help us
Yeah.
come to new insights, and it's kind of like altering our state of consciousness because we're seeing things from differently, and we're kind of forced into that by
Yeah, yeah.
solving the riddle. We can only solve it when we shift our perspective and framing, like you said.
Yeah, I mean, I think insight is a sort of micro altering in your state of consciousness. That's why we have this phenomenological, we have this sort of opening sense, and you have this flash sense. And like I say, when you start to get that extended in a cascade of insights in something like flow, that is definitely you lose, you lose that autobiographical narrative sense of self. You have tremendous sense of at-one-ment, right? It's got this paradoxical quality in that you know that you're exerting lots of metabolic energy expenditure, but nevertheless it feels effortless and graceful. It already has a lot of properties of more explicit mystical states. And so already I think, this is what I'm saying, there's a continuity between mystical states and then flow states, which are already, I think, clearly alternative states of consciousness, mindfulness, which is an altered state of consciousness, and even a little flash of an altered state of consciousness that's going on in insight. And Topolinsky and Reber argue for something sort of very similar to that idea in one of their papers.
When you're talking about the spending of metabolic energy as being part of it, that was something that I was thinking about too, in looking at my own meaningful experiences. There's always the element of paying attention. Like I'm invested in the exchange or the experience in some way. And it seems to me that it's essential that meaningful experiences have to be reciprocal. Like we have to be giving something in order to receive as well.
Oh, totally. I mean, that is one, in fact, that's one of the features that you need in order for even to induce the flow state. There has to be a tight coupling between me and the environment. I do things and then the environment responds, and they make sense. They're highly relevant to each other, right? Such that, for example, error is really costly and I'll fall out of the flow state if I generate a significant error. Yeah, and paying attention, I think, is really crucial. But you're right; it's paying attention in a particular way. I talk about this in the series, right? I mean, there's and Anna Langer made. I mean, there's hard focus where you just focus on the item, right? And then there's soft vigilance, like where instead of just saying focus, 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 I say notice the shape of the glass. It's narrow at the bottom, it's wider at the top. There's this squiggly thing in between. Oh, that reminds you of Charlie Brown, right? And now you can pay attention much longer. And not only that what's called soft vigilance, you are already getting yourself to shift around, alter what you find interesting, interesse, to be within something, right? What you're finding interesting, you're using your attention to alter what you find salient, what you find relevant, what you find important, because you're doing this exploratory. So I would suggest to you, and I think this is probably the case, because I mean, I do yoga, I do Tai Chi Chuan, that you don't have that hard focused on your body. You have that, because you talked about curiosity. You have this exploratory, investigatory, not theorizing. You're not theorizing, but you're doing something with your attention, like what I was directing you to do with the glass. You're trying to open up the phenomena. You're actually trying to afford its expression to you as you are exploring it. So there's this tight coupling between your exploration of it and its expression to you.
Yeah, no, that really rings true to me. In Patanjali, he, in his outlining of the method of Ashtanga yoga, the stages related to meditation leading to samadhi. The first stage is focusing your concentration on an object. Mm-hmm. The second stage, dhyana, is when there starts this interchange starts to happen, and you're receiving information as you're projecting your attention. Yeah. So exactly what you talked about, like that's a great word. There, a coupling happens.
Yeah, exactly.
And we start to gain new information or insight about the object.
Yeah, I think that's why there's so many wisdom traditions. I mean, Hebrew's famous for this, that use sexual intercourse metaphors for wisdom. Right?
Can you give an example of that?
What's the word in Hebrew? I think it's, I can't remember. Okay, but you'll know, if you read the King James Version of the Bible, it'll still come clear. So if you're reading the Old Testament, Adam knew Eve, and then they had Cain and Abel. So the word in English is new because it's a Hebrew word for know, but Adam's knowing Eve produces their son, because it's also the word, that word for knowing, right? A kind of knowing and wisdom, right? Is also the word for sexual intercourse, right? So you have, and by the way, that's how you can, Aaron's work shows that's how you sort of induce love. I mean, you should have mutually accelerating, what's he called it? I can't remember the exact phrase he has, but the idea here is you and your partner, you sort of open yourself up, you just mutually accelerating disclosure, and you disclose, and then they disclose, and then you disclose more, and and as long as you got that reciprocal realization going, you fall in love. And that's how you get that. And so the connections between love and, sexual intercourse and this kind of participatory knowing, the metaphors for this are across the tradition. Or I'll give you another example. The whole tantric tradition is about linking, right, these mindfulness transformations of consciousness and cognition to sexual intercourse and union, right?
Yeah. It reminds me of like those first stages of getting to know someone, when all you're doing is like pouring out your stories to each other.
Yeah.
There's so much like juiciness in that. And it's like, once you've exhausted the stories, that goes to a trickle. And that's where the real work of maintaining a strong connection comes in.
So you have to move to the other orders. You can't rely on the narrative, right? You have to move to the, to the nomological and the normative orders. You have to really get at, okay, how are you growing as a person? How are you self-transcending? How can I afford that? And how can your path afford my path of growth? And so you've got to move off the narrative onto the normative, and also onto the nomological. How are you making more sense about the world? Like, what is the world meaning to you? Well, how's it meaning to me? How can we coordinate these together so they're also doing reciprocal realization? The reciprocal realization doesn't have to die. You just have to move to, if I can use a metaphor, you have to move off the horizontal narrative and onto the vertical, normative and nomological. Like, how are we connecting to reality, right? And how are we connecting to our own better selves? And how is that deeply connected to how we are connected? So, I'm very fortunate to be with somebody who we have this kind of relationship, and we're like more than 4 years in, and you sort of know the person, like you said, the stories, but we have moved to those other orders in I think a very healthy and for me and for her a very happy fashion. So.
I think that's really great. I never thought about that before, but you're right. It does move into this verticality where we're looking at, beyond the narrative into the deeper meaning of our life and sharing that. And it makes me think about, being a yoga teacher, on a retreat, I often get women coming on their own, and they might be married, but their husband's at home watching football on the couch. And they become what I think of, as spiritual widows in some way. It's they're getting interested in the verticality of life. Like, what's the meaning of life? What's my purpose? There's something more to life than football and 2.5% beer. And the partner isn't so interested in that. So they're not meeting them. They're not on that vertical journey together. And that's where they can, the relationship can fall apart.
I think that's exactly right. Fortunately, my partner, she's an excellent practitioner of yoga, and I had done a bit before because I did it sporadically in conjunction with doing Tai Chi and Qigong and the Vipassana and Metta and things like that. But she got me intensely interested in it, and so it's something we share and do together. And we talk about, and there's other practices where we're sort of starting to do together. We also spend a lot of time developing conversational styles that are about this vertical dimension, and really practicing them with each other in the good sense of the word practice.
Yeah, I find my wife and I, because we both have our individual yoga practices. My wife's also an astrologer, so she's looking at the world through that lens.
Sure.
We'll often meet in the kitchen, and we end up sitting on the kitchen floor having these, conversations about the insights that we've come to. We call them the kitchen floor conversations that can go like, dinner's getting cold on the stove while we're into this dialogue where we're just both deeply engaged in.
There you go.
And through talking about the insight, it's a way to integrate it for me.
Yeah.
And I find that incredibly useful to have someone to talk to about it.
I mean, this is the original Platonic or even Socratic insight, that if you, like, the insights you have on your own are dwarfed by the insights you have in dialogue with other people. I mean, that is one of the deep lessons that I took from Plato, and that has stayed with me. That's why have I ever published anything on my own? I mean, I've given conference talks on my own, obviously, but whenever I publish, and usually for the conference talks as well, I work with other people. It's just what I think it's just way, way better. It has been for me. And so I totally get what you're talking about. I mean, I think the problem is we don't have a good word for this. I mean, the word we can use is friendship, but, we have this fuzzy meaning of friendship in our culture. It can be anywhere from, somebody is your soulmate to somebody's your drinking buddy. Right. And you alluded to that a few minutes ago. But I think, if we understand, friendship in this deep sense, the way Aristotle and Plato, especially Aristotle, talked about it, then what you and your wife and me and my partner are doing, we're cultivating, this deep friendship love. Again, don't trivialize it and don't make it superficial. This is a deep and profound kind of love, right? And it tends to replace the sort of more narratively driven kind of thing.
Yeah, the poet and ritualist John O'Donohue talks about the anamkara, which is, I think, a Celtic word, which means soul friend.
You're right. That's a good term. That's a great term. Soulmate should have that connotation, but people have lost the sense of mate as, friendship, and think of it more as a sexual term. And so that unfortunately it gets lost when people talk about soulmate. But soul friend's a really good term, actually.
I know. Yeah, he does a great piece on Amkara and describes what the soul friend is. And it just helped kind of click things into perspective, because often when I'm teaching yoga, I like to subvert hierarchies. And so I don't want to see the people I'm teaching yoga to as my clients or my students necessarily. Right. But, I like to see myself as a helpful friend who's learned some things that have been good for me that I just want to share.
Yeah, a good teacher always shares their learning rather than their knowledge. That's also, as a teacher, that's one of the things that's central to my pedagogy. I share my learning rather than sharing my knowledge with my students.
Yeah, and that learning is always
ongoing. Exactly.
Always evolving. Yeah.
Exactly.
And then, like, in the sharing of it, often that's when new insights come in, and
totally.
I find myself finding myself in a flow state when I'm engaged in
teaching. Totally. I have the same thing when I'm teaching, both when I'm teaching academically and when I'm teaching Tai Chi or meditation. I know exactly what you're talking about, and that's part, like, when we're done, yes, the students salute me, but they also salute the senior students, and they also salute each other. Because I try to say, you're not just learning from me, you're also learning from the senior student, and you should also be learning from each other throughout the entire time.
Yeah, my teacher would say that there's always three elements involved. It's the teacher, the student, and the teaching.
Yes, the teaching, and I tell them,
it's that interchange, that exchange, which is the teaching. It's not just the one way.
Exactly.
Yeah, projection of information, but it's in that exchange. That's the teaching, and I like that. Going back to what we talked about in terms of that reciprocal engagement,
reciprocal realization.
The coupling, like you said.
Yeah, the coupling. Yeah, totally. Yeah, and again, that makes that experience deeply meaningful for both participants. Yeah, I think that's important, and that's one of the pieces of advice I give to my students. Where, like, if because I'm teaching at the university, right? That they're going to move on and they're looking for a place. I say, look for a place that emphasizes the teaching, not the teacher, and that the teaching has that sort of reciprocal, participatory feel to it. Because that's there's no fail-safe rules. They don't exist, but that's a very good heuristic rule for trying to get away from, abusive and exploitative situations.
Yeah, that's great. So going back to what caused you to put together this lecture series, and it got me thinking about the current state of our Western culture and like what's going on and what I see as symptoms of a lack of meaning and purpose in life.
Yep. Many people are coming to this conclusion independently, convergently.
Yeah. So what have you identified as the symptoms of a lack of meaning in our culture?
So some of the symptoms are, there's increasing aspects of loneliness, mental health crisis, addiction crisis, the opioid crisis. You have that while worldwide suicide is declining, it's on the increase, as are anxiety and depressive disorders amongst young adults, teenagers and adults. You have increasing disenfranchisement from established religious institutions, also from social clubs and institutions. And so you got this fragmentation going on. People feel more fragmented in their individual lives. Yeah, you've got this weird, it's almost a paradox. Everything is being politicized sort of voraciously, while at the same time people are losing faith and becoming disenfranchised from any political process. So they're not joining political parties, they're not voting, they're deeply cynical about all politicians, all political processes. And so you've got and that makes sense together if there's a crisis that they want this to be working and it's not. We've got the degeneration of our political and democratic discourse from what I would call what used to be opponent processing. Your body makes use of opponent processing, like the relationship between your sympathetic and parasympathetic system. These are systems that work for opponent goals, right? But they work together to give you an overall adaptive response to the government, to the environment. And governments used to understand this, that the opposition was opponent processing. It's to make the overall process of democracy self-correcting. And that has broken down into adversarial winner-take-all. This is a point that my friend Leo Ferraro and I talk about a lot. And he really has helped me develop it in important ways. And I owe a lot to Leo about this. For this point. And so, right, it's that's another symptom of it. You have the increasing pervasive sense. We track this in the book and I'm using this term in a technical sense, the way Frankfurt uses it, that there's more and more bullshit in our lives. Bullshit is everywhere and it's becoming pervasive, overwhelming. People often feel like they're drowning in it, such that you have the default stance that people are increasingly taking is one of a very I want to say superficial in the sense that it's not sort of deeply philosophically argued, but it's an enacted cynicism and nihilism. That's a default position. I think on the other hand, you see other symptoms, like I think the mindfulness revolution is a response. People are trying to get something to address this meaning crisis. You see the beginnings of replacements for the lost institutions. So many people, I point to you, myself, oh, you go to church? Of course not. Where do you go on Sunday morning? Well, I go to the yoga studio and I get together with a bunch of human beings and we do this whole ritual together to alter a state of consciousness, right? And that's kind of what religions used to do for us, right? And so, yeah, I'm not going to say you're religious by doing that, but what I'm saying is this is trying to take a role or perform a function that people feel that has been lost in the culture in general, right? The growing confluence between cognitive science and Buddhism, even academically and scientifically, I think is a symptom of it. The whole zombie mythology, why we have had just this spike in zombies, in our culture, and people even enact. They go on zombie walks. We talked about this in the book a lot. And the zombie is clearly a symbol of the meaning crisis, right? They lack intelligibility. They lack the capacity for making meaning. They consume voraciously, but they're never satisfied. They move with other people, but they don't have a community. They drift aimlessly with no narrative purpose. And the apocalypse that they bring about doesn't rejuvenate or renew the world. It just deadens the world into an empty, void, an opening horizon of empty meaninglessness, right? They aren't supernatural. They're just us in decayed, ugly form. Like we feel like zombies sometimes when we're shuffling down the streets and there's people around us and we've had an alienating day and which, we're not connected and we're feeling that loneliness and we're feeling like, everything's just very consumptive and competitive. I mean, and so I think the zombie mythology is a clear symptomatic expression of the meaning crisis. I think the attempts, like I said, to try and create, ideological replacements for religious frameworks are symptomatic. I think they're problematic in that, and in that trying to solve the meaning crisis on the level of propositional belief is the wrong place to solve it. So if you're trying to solve the meaning crisis by creating an ideology, right, that you're going to use to defeat other ideologies, you're missing it because you're missing all of these embodied psychotechnological transformative processes that you and I have been talking about that you need to actually have in place to address the meaning crisis. And I think some of Stephen Batchelor's work on this, especially, the books like Alone with Others and Buddhism Without Beliefs, point to exactly that argument. So I think, against the rise of, powerful ideological and, often tending toward their symptomatic expression of the meaning crisis. So I think that's what comes to mind right now. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack in there, but one thing I'm thinking about, you pointed to people being drawn to meditation centers and videos, looking for something that's been lost in our culture.
Mm-hmm. We have no wisdom institutions.
Yeah, and I think speaking as a yoga teacher, a lot of the elements that make life meaningful aren't actually present in yoga studios. Like you talked about being in a crowd, but being isolated. And I think that's what often happens in these yoga studios. And it is still based on a consumer model where people come in, they throw down their card, they unroll their mat, they do their thing, and then they get up and leave.
Right.
And there isn't that communal exchange that really I think is essential.
Yeah.
So I think there are some things lacking in how we're trying to find that again.
I think so the place where for one thing, I practice with my partner, and so that makes it more communal, and she knows people there, kind of thing. But I mean, with the degree to which you can bring in some chanting, the degree to which you can bring in pranayama, because breathing in sync together, right, and chanting together starts to bring in this communal shared sense of presence that you've been talking about. I think what has to be brought in, and this will be difficult, right, is some of the more ancient ritual elements that went with yoga practice to give people, again, a symbolic frame that they can all share together. I mean, obviously that has to be done carefully and reflectively. But yeah, I agree with you. I think I think that there's going to be more pressure on yoga studios and such to do this. I've been asked by one branch of yoga studios to come and give talks about the science of mindfulness and these ideas, because they want to share as a community how to deepen the practice. And I think we keep doing this, right? So yoga was misappropriated largely as sort of an exercise, right? And I think the ecology of mindfulness practices you find in Buddhism has been misappropriated as a single practice of seated meditation That's not the Eightfold Path, right? It's not the Eightfold Path. There's the reason why right mindfulness or right meditation is in the Eightfold Path is because wrong mindfulness and wrong meditation are a real possibility for people, right? And so, creating these ecology of practices that are about long-term transformation rather than just health.
Personal well-being. And I think, I'm not a Buddhist scholar or anything, but isn't there something about right action and
totally.
Right? So like the personal practice is for having healthier engagement with the outside world and people.
Yeah. Right? I have that slogan when I'm teaching people the meditation. I keep saying to them over and over again, meditation is not a vacation, it's an education. Right? Mm-hmm. You're not leaving your life to go on vacation for an hour. You are going to a place to learn more deeply how to live your life.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. One of the things that I've been finding really nourishing for myself is bringing shamanism into a more regular context. Like I go down to the Amazon and visit ayahuasca shamans and all that, but that's not really accessible to a lot of people.
No, it's not.
Nor is it appropriate for a lot of people.
Yeah. I wouldn't recommend that to a lot of people as a thing to start with.
So what I've actually been doing is drumming circles where I'm drumming and people are going on a shamanic journey. I give them some very basic instruction. So they're having that inward then outward journey. But a crucial aspect of it that I've been finding like really incredible is the sharing circle after.
Yes.
And having that communal sharing around the campfire thing just feels just super nourishing and exactly what's needed right now.
I've had the privilege of participating in a Sufi chant, which is very similar. There's the drum, there's the intense drumming, there's the chanting. You sit in a circle, and then of course afterwards there's dialogue. And so I think that's very, and that goes back to some of the core shamanic psychotechnologies, right? You've got the drumming, you usually have chanting, right, associated with it, and then you have the shared, potentially reinforced altered state of consciousness, and then you have some discussive framework around it that tries to, open it up, express it, articulate it, solidify it for people. I think that's good. Go ahead.
Well, those are like some possible solutions, like what we can bring into spaces that are already happening. Although I think it's really difficult in like a commercial yoga studio because, in order to pay the rent in a place like Toronto or Vancouver, you got to pack the people in and one class butts up to the next. So there's not really an opportunity to open up space for like that free flow of dialogue and sharing. So that's a problem. So I think maybe finding alternative spaces, which is what I've been doing a lot of, trying to, find spaces where I have a bit more leeway in terms of timing.
I think we also need to, there's also the problem of overcoming, the inertia of unfamiliarity. I think if we start to create either virtually or actual in situ places that are ecology of practices. I was taught of Vipassana, Metta, and Tai Chi together, right? And where people go in and we have sort of systematically vetted, practiced, understood sets of psychotechnologies like drumming, right? Like yoga, like a meditation, right? Like, reflective practices, and we put them together into a mutually reinforcing, each practice has its strengths and its weaknesses. We should reflectively, rationally, put together sets of psychotechnologies that, have compensatory relationships to each other. They act as checks and balances on each other's strengths and weaknesses and offer that in a consistent, reliable fashion. I predict that we will be able to find a market for that.
Yeah. I'm finding as I put these things together, my wife and I do these nights where I'll lead people through a simple yoga practice, some simple breath and movement, very much like a Qigong or Tai Chi. Mm-hmm. And then we'll do a sound journey where people are lying down and going inward. And then we've got that interpersonal aspect of the sharing circle. And for me, that's just, my interest putting them all together. I was with a teacher once and she's a singing teacher But she learned a little bit about me in the week I was with her, and she said, you know what? It's yoga, music, and shamanism are all one, and that's your job. That's your dharma, is to bring those things together.
Yeah.
And what I found is that they're all, like you said, complementary of each other.
Yeah.
And so just, more and more trying to bring those together into spaces and kind of experimenting and seeing if there's interest for that. And I'm finding as I bring those things together, I'm getting a lot more interest than when I just offer something like a yoga course.
Yep, I think that, like I said, I think that's what people are hungering for. They're hungering for wisdom. They're not just hungering for an exercise or a practice to improve this aspect of health, or give them relaxation for a while. At least a significant number of people, I think, are being motivated by the meaning crisis. I would add one more element to it, and which is, I think we are in the place now where there is much more serious and good scientific investigation of a lot of these psychotechnologies and practices, and they should also become part of the process by which we vet and select the psychotechnologies. So, of course, we should pay attention to traditional history, but like the course, we should not only pay attention to the history, we should pay attention to the science as we're trying to so I do a lot of scientific work, right, on, what's happening in mindfulness, what's happening in these mystical experiences, what's happening with attention, and trying to get, because, if we get a better scientific understanding, then of course we can optimize these psychotechnologies like we've always done when we get a better scientific understanding of what's going on in them.
Yeah, this kind of leads to something I wanted to ask you about. So seeing this like incredible burst of popularity in these YouTube lectures with people like yourself and Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris, obviously there's a lot of people are really hungry for meaning and meaningful conversations. Although I guess I'm wondering if it just seems like it's maybe all a bit too intellectual and there's not enough practice in all of that. And I'm wondering if it's just feeding this kind of Western tendency to want to accumulate information, confuse it with knowledge and get stuck there.
Okay, so I mean, I have, I think, a principled response. First of all, in my life, as I've mentioned to you, I not only do the academic work, I teach the Tai Chi and manipulation. I also ran an evening wisdom sangha trying to create, ecologies of practices for about 5 or 6 years at the University of Toronto. I had to stop just because of scheduling reasons. I had a child and things like that. But so I am committed to that. In fact, that's very important. And part of the argument, all I can do on a video series is make an argument, right? I'll make one qualification for that in a sec. And what I'm trying to do is make an argument for the difference between wisdom and knowledge, and make a developed argument, as we've been doing here today, for these perspectival and participatory aspects of knowing that are not captured just by putting things into propositional statements. So that's part of the core thrust of the theory, the series, and that's part of the core theory of it. I also have made videos that I've released, and I'm going to make a set of videos at the end of the series about how to meditate, how to contemplate, maybe here's a basic kind of movement practice you can do. What would it be to invoke some of the Stoic psychotechnologies, some of the Neoplatonic psychotechnologies? Like, how do we bring these together? So I have some of those already out there. There's 5 videos on practice. Man, I'm going to do that I'm also going to bring in dialogue with people on the meaning crisis who are practitioners, like a Jungian psychotherapist, have a dialogue with them, see what's the relationship between that kind of practice. Bring in ideas about how you might want to bring in something that you alluded to earlier. I mean, there's a lot of good scientific work and some very good work on. There's a lot of trash, but there's also some very good work on inducing lucid dreaming and getting that to be a very powerful way for people to explore depths of the psyche. I think Wagner's book on it is really good, and especially what you get to is people move through stages where initially they're really focused on the content of the lucid world. But eventually what they do is they instead want not to focus on the content. They want to get to the source of the process that's generating all the insight and the wisdom. They want to travel towards the source of the insight of the wisdom rather than just getting enmeshed like in that world. And that can be a deeply transformative thing. So, there's psychodynamic psychotechnologies that have, I think, scientific legitimacy. We have experimental evidence that if I induce lucid dreaming in you, it makes you more insightful in your waking life. So again, there's a lot of work being done, and I want to talk to people about those things too at the end. Now, I can't teach people via I can teach them sort of basic, but I can't be in-person teaching. But what I hope to do is give people a taste for the practices and the psychotechnology, both by presenting some initial things they can do and some initial people that exemplify the kind of people they might meet, so that they are afforded and facilitated with going out and trying to meet the people and find the sets of practices that they need to engage in.
That's great. Yeah. And that's one of the reasons why I wanted to have you in particular on the podcast, is because what I saw was that you're bringing the science, the kind of the technologies, and also I think the art of it all.
Yes.
The metaphor and all that, bringing all that together, which is something that I've been seeing lacking, and kind of, a bit worrisome. Like Jordan Peterson's getting so popular, Sam Harris is getting so popular, and it's like, feels very heady to me, like very like intellectual. And I think that's already a tendency in the Western mind, is want to, consume information just like we consume everything else. And so I'm really happy that it seems like, you seem very passionate about bringing the practices into it.
Yeah, I'm constantly talking about them already in this series.
Yeah, but I think maybe that's in response to you seeing the same thing. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, part of it is, Jordan and I are colleagues at the University of Toronto, and part of it is we come from a different orientation. The set of practices that Jordan is relying on, I think, are what I would call the psychotechnologies, right? The systematic set of, skills that and sensibilities that are being trained. It's largely in a Jungian framework, right? So his science is personality theory, and his set of psychotechnologies is Jungian. The thing that Jordan typically doesn't do is talk about some of those psychotechnological practices, like what is it to do dream work? What is it to do active imagination? What is it to engage in, an appropriate dialogue with somebody else that's trying to, so that's missing. Now I come,
and
go ahead.
The embodied practices too.
Yeah, totally.
Breathing and moving.
Yeah, well, that's what I was just going to say. I come from a different framework. I went through Jungian therapy, and as a patient, and I did a whole host of workshops because I really wanted to understand it, right? So I'm not an expert like Jordan is, but I think it's fair to say I have a good educated understanding of it. But my background is it's the Western Platonic philosophical tradition, and then Taoist to Tai Chi and Qigong, right? And then pranayama and yoga, right? And all these other practices, like you said. And all, of course, the meditation and the contemplation, the reflection, the dialogue practices. And so I have, my framework is just much more embodied in its orientation. And my cognitive science, I'm an advocate of what's called third generation cog sci, which emphasizes our embodiment and our connectedness, our extension into the environment as fundamental dimensions by which we're going to understand cognition and consciousness. So I'm just oriented that way much more than Jordan is. Sam Harris, I don't know what to say about Sam Harris. I'm not a big fan of his style of argumentation and presentation of material. But yeah, I would agree with you at least on this, that he is not getting into I don't want to be unfair to him, so I was perhaps a little harsh. I mean, he does talk about mindfulness and it's important. I don't know, I haven't seen from him how that systematically fits into what he's doing in his podcasts. Like, what's the connection between his practice and the scientific frame? He points to them being connected.
There's not really integration there.
That's right. That's my criticism. And you're reinforcing that. So many people have converged on that. Many people have shared that sort of same thing with me. It's how those pieces fit together are missing. And a lot of people come to my work after sort of, well, being in the Sam Harris fold, precisely because other than sort of having new beliefs, they don't know, they're dead in the water. It's what do I do? How does this transform my life? How does this make my life more meaningful? And then they find, we've got to open up the discourse. We've got to talk a lot more about wisdom and a lot less about specific belief sets.
That's great. And it's like, I think there needs to be someone there to receive people when they get to that stage of, okay, now what?
Yeah.
You know, you've made me conscious of all my problems and like what's wrong with the world. Now, what's my response to that?
Yeah.
And I think the response is embodied practices, communal practices, all of those things, right?
I agree with that, but I would add that those practices can't be can't be ad hoc, and they can't be just autodidactic, right? Because that's very dangerous. Because that's an arena. That's what social media does, right? It just reinforces bias and like in this ever accelerating thing. Those processes have to be set. I like Stephen's. I met Stephen Batchelor, so. I like Stephen's idea of a culture of awakening. The psychotechnologies have to be systematically related to each other, as we were talking about earlier, and they have to be set into a community of shared commitment and shared responsibility, right? So we have to create a culture around the practices that also, right, and one more move, and this is the move that the series is also trying to address, that culture has to have an intellectually respectable worldview. It has to be able to integrate or at least respond in an intellectually respectable manner to the pervasive scientific worldview, because that is not going away. People who want nostalgically to somehow we'll get rid of the science, that's not going to happen. It's a part of the equation now, for sure. Yeah, it's an irremovable part of the equation.
Yeah, no, that's really good. That's really good. I like all of those pieces, how they fit together. That feels really whole and complete to me. Yeah. I feel like really complete. We covered a lot in this, and I felt like we took, the 9 hours of the lecture series that I've watched so far. I got to talk to you about all the different aspects that were jumping out to me, and really able to clarify some of those ideas.
Great.
So I think we did pretty good in an hour.
Oh.
At least where my interest lies. So, is there anything else that you wanted to say? Like, what's coming up?
Well, I feel. Well, I mean, like we've released the 10th video. We've filmed 28, and the plan is for 50. So there's a ways to go on that. And then, like I said, I want to do some, supplementary stuff on here's practices, and then here's dialogue with people. So there's a lot coming, and so I would invite people to check out the series. They can follow me on Twitter if they want to see where I'm giving other podcasts, talks. And so I want to be clear about this. I really started this project because I care about helping people address the meaning crisis. And so I really, it's important to that. And this is sort of hard for me to do by nature. I'm sort of by nature quite socially phobic. Crazy thing for a teacher to be, right? And so I hesitated doing this for quite a while. And so I want to express right now, and I keep doing it, but I'm going to keep doing it. I want to express gratitude, like real, genuine gratitude for the support, the constructive criticism that I'm receiving from people, and the opportunities like you've afforded me to dialogue about this and make it available and accessible to people. Thank you very much for that.
Well, thanks a lot for your work. I think you're addressing the most important issues that we're facing right now. So thanks a lot. And I look forward to following your work, man.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay.
How do you